Welcome to Solutions with Courtney Anderson. I am Courtney Anderson, and this is the 181st show. And I am delighted that you have taken time out of your life to join me for the program. We have a show today that is one of the Help Situation Spotlight series, and our Help Situation Spotlight we focus on exactly what it sounds like. Community members like yourself reach out, share questions, ideas, concerns, issues, and then I try to come up with some potential solution sets, and we discuss those in the program. So this series is all about you and your concerns, issues, and I want to encourage you to reach out, send me your feedback to the programs. Give me your show suggestions. All these Help Situation Spotlight Series shows come from you. As I mentioned, we are in episode 181. Unbelievable. I'm stunned that we've done this many shows. This, of course, is our daily audio talk show podcast. And our specific show today is one that is a bit, well, I was going to say it's a bit somber, it's a bit maybe emotionally heavy, but then I was thinking, well, maybe we need to look at it a little bit differently. Our specific show episode today is a work colleague has experienced a tragic death of a loved one. What should I do? So again, this is the Help Situation Spotlight series, and the specific issue we're dealing with today is a work colleague has experienced a tragic death of a loved one. What should I do? And as I said, the sort of initial inclination is to think, well, this is a bit of a of a serious of a somber show, but let's be more holistic. Of course, what we are always focusing on are a couple of principles. One is surpassing our goals. And of course, we often are talking about those goals in a very positive, forward-looking, optimistic way. But to be very accurate, we're going to have goals that are maybe not so sort of alluring and sort of attractive. And it's a goal that if you haven't experienced this specific show topic, the odds are in your entire lifetime that you will experience a situation where a colleague has experienced a tragic death of a loved one. And potentially in your life you're going to experience where you're the person, you're the colleague. And it's still a goal, right? What should I do? What do I do to help the colleague? And if you ever get to a point in your life when you are that colleague, you're still going to have a goal. How do I absorb this? So again, we often want to sort of think goal, and we think, yeah, goal. I'm going to get the promotion. I'm going to, buy my dream home. I'm going to accomplish that big goal with my volunteer group. We're going to, eradicate, you know, this medical condition in a certain population. We're always focused on sort of the sunnier side of it, but we have to, and a lot of what we're doing is trying to look at the entire situation. When we talk about even practicing the joyful art of business, which is another fundamental principle that I address often, the idea there is that you ask yourself, when you're looking at what you do with your time that you invest in your professional activities, you ask yourself, how do you feel? Right? Because if you're not feeling good more than you're feeling negative, we're just calling that joy, then kind of what's the point? And that it's not enough to say, hey, but I make money, people are impressed by that, or hey, I have economic opportunity, or hey, I've been acclaimed, or I won awards. That doesn't matter if you're miserable. And again, we're always sort of pulling back our frame and trying to see a wider view. And so certainly the show today is part of the wide view. It's part of the entirety of the situation. And when we're dealing with our lives, Of course, one of the things that I've am known as is the workplace relationship expert for many reasons, but basically because I focus a lot on the the relationship between people. I focus on internal issues that people sort of bring to work, their own fears, apprehensions, goals, motivation, and then how that it sort of interacts with other people at work, right? Peers, supervisors, vendors. And part of that also, that workplace relationship is going to be dealing with issues like this. Your work colleague has experienced a tragic death of a loved one. What should you do? So, again, let's not sort of paint this as a oh, this is not a positive show. It is a really positive show because this is something that when it happens, there may not have been uh, you know training in the workplace. There may not be readily available for someone who's facing this, especially for the first time, any clue of what they could do or should do to be most effective. So let's sort of dive into it. As I was saying, I do ask you to come to CourtneyAnderson.com. That's our main website where we have an individual show page. So this episode 181 on CourtneyAnderson.com, you're going to see a whole page just devoted to this show where you can download the program if you haven't already done so. It's got additional notes, links to any other resources I've referred to. Also, it has our show sponsors. I have to mention that. Part of keeping the show going and growing is focusing on our continued expanded infrastructure. And part of that, of course, are the ads and the links you see. So please, if there's anything that you catches your eye, click on those and support our show sponsors. We're talking about something that's uncomfortable for a lot of people, right? So, death itself is uncomfortable for many of us for multiple reasons. And then a tragic death. So maybe someone was, the death was maybe part of a criminal act. Maybe they were, murdered. Maybe the death was self-inflicted. Maybe the person committed suicide. Maybe the death was a tragic accident. Their loved one was, bicycling or riding in a vehicle or swimming or, honestly anything. And maybe it's their child. Maybe it's their spouse. Maybe it's their parent. Maybe it's their sibling. Maybe it's their, their best friend, the person they're closest to. The situation is, again, something that's uncomfortable for many people. And so when we were looking at this show and putting together the notes, one of the things I immediately thought of is several years ago, I went through a very time-intensive and content-intensive program where I was being trained as a volunteer. So I've talked in many programs. We have a episode of this show where we talk about being of service, and I referenced many different programs over the years, the different types of ways I try to be of service. And so often I try to be of service in some way related to something I do professionally because I might have, extra knowledge. I could help people. So I do a reasonable amount of service as a volunteer as a lawyer, which, makes sense, right? Like I know all this information anyway. So it's something that's it's easy for me to do, and people have questions, concerns, and needs. So volunteering as a lawyer in clinics and for cases and everything is something I've done since I opened my law practice in 1998. So I've been doing it for a while. But I don't only do things as a lawyer. I mean, I have other, just like you and I, we all have things we can do. So if we have, physical things that we can do, we can lift something or carry something. So if you've, worked with organizations that deliver food, Meals on Wheels is one that I've worked with. There's all types of opportunities for you to be of service. It doesn't have to necessarily relate to something you know. So if you know something, it makes sense. Like, hey, you're a carpenter, and you go out and you help build homes and lodging for people who are without that. That makes sense because you already have carpenter expertise. So why not use that? Maybe your Habitat for Humanity and some other type of organizations where you're using your skills. It's like, I'm a lawyer, so I use that skill. But we can all do other things. So like I said, even you can use whatever you have. If you have the ability with your body to carry something, then you can deliver food, or you can um, move things around at an organization. Maybe I'm moving around at a, we're having a, sometimes in the U.S. they call it soup kitchens, the idea where people who are hungry and don't have resources to procure food, we're going to give it to them. But somebody, you got to make the food, you got to carry the food, you got to provide the food, you got to, make sure people have their utensils and something to eat with, something to drink. So there's a lot that you can do, and it doesn't have to be relegated to some sort of, you know, well, I don't have any expertise. You don't need expertise to do this. The people will, at every one of these organizations I've ever gone to, there are people on site and there's usually a very well set up structure to talk to you and evaluate what your skills would be, and then to have somebody train and or supervise you so that you're not having to be worried you're doing something that's making things worse for for the client population you're serving. So that none of those things are realistic. And anyway, all this is to say, so a couple of years ago, one of the things I did volunteer for was this very intensive program in what they call victim services, and basically, short story, police department. Obviously, when something tragic happens, often the police are called. So there's been a car accident, a bike accident, slip and fall, and drowning, whatever. Um, and there's been a crime, right? So there's been a murder. There's been an assault where somebody's injured and then passes away. There's been a suicide. There's who's called? The police. So what happened several years ago? I volunteered for victim services. So what happened? The police department is called out. Now, the police officers have a whole area of expertise of training, and then they have sub expertise, right? So they have different types of um, advanced skills that certain law enforcement professionals will learn, and then they have sort of their general skills, and they go through even an academy, and it's very intensive. So they learn about the laws, based on where they are in their jurisdiction. They learn about specific job tasks they're going to do, and then, as I said, as they move through their career, they have other subspecialties where people will focus on this type of issue or that type of issue or whatever. One of the things, though, that they in many instances don't have necessarily the most um, intensive amount of work is in terms of the emotion, the emotional issues. So they know how to do the work, right? Like how to secure the crime scene, or how to investigate and or talk to witnesses or whatever. Like that's their job. That's what they're focusing on. The challenge, of course, in real life is when you show up and there's been a car accident. There's been a violent altercation. There's been a homicide or a suicide. Especially when there other people are there, right? So there's someone there when the police arrive who is suffering their own shock, especially if they were also in an accident or they were also involved in whatever horrible thing happened that resulted in a death. And so they're there on scene, and the police are there trying to start doing their work, and yet you've got somebody who at that exact moment is either was there the whole time, or who has come to the scene, and that's their child, that's their spouse, that's their best friend, that's the person who meant everything to them. And so their reaction, of course, is going to be what any of our reactions would be. There'll be a variety of different things, but the police were putting forward this very intensive program for what they call victim services, and it's what it sounds like. It's someone who is, and it was really intense. I don't remember the duration, but it was months. I'm not exaggerating. I mean, it was months of programs and courses. It was really, really interesting. And it would be content training where they would talk to us about sort of what the police would do, and for first responders, they would talk to us about different situations. What if it's a little child that's there and it was their parent that's deceased? Because there's going to be different, challenges. If you have a child, you got to, someone has to take responsibility for the little child and get them to safety, and then start the whole process of trying to figure out what's going to happen. Is there someone that's a loved one or another family member? If there's not anybody else, then there are government agencies that are going to have to be called in. And then there's other issues if it's an adult. What if it's somebody who's there and it was their loved one that's deceased, and that person themselves is injured, or they're themselves in shock and need to go get medical treatment? There's so much that happens. And one of the things that was really interesting that I had never done before that I thought was fascinating. Now, of course, this was a couple of years ago, but it's, after I've already, practiced law as a lawyer. So I've seen a lot of these situations, because I've, been a lawyer on cases where there were, crimes and things, but I hadn't ever worked in a police department. I'm not a police officer. So it was interesting. They took us on a tour of sort of a emergency call center, where in the U.S. it's the number is 911. In different parts of the world they're different numbers, but it's the emergency number you call to the government. And then when you call it, they get the information, the dispatcher, and then they send out whatever, the fire department to put your fire out, or the police officers to come help you, or whatever. And so I had never toured one of these call centers before, where the 911, where the dispatch operators work, and it was really interesting because you think about it. And especially in parts of the world where these systems work really well. In other words, the expectation for people in many parts of the world when you call the emergency services number is that it's 24 hours, 7 days a week, no matter what the situation is, whether it's in the middle of a hurricane, or it doesn't matter. Like that's the last line of help, and the expectation in many parts of the world is when I call, they're going to answer immediately. And then they're going to try to help me and send the fire department or the police or both or whoever. So you expect it to work. You expect the person to be, really good at what they do. And then you expect it to be up and running all the time, right? And that they're immediately on their job, and that they're sending out the help, and the help's going to get there quick. And in many parts of the world, certainly in the U.S., there's always it's a huge news story when there's one of these situations where the dispatchers in society's mind, didn't do what they were supposed to, or made a mistake, because people's expectation is you can't make a mistake. Literally someone's calling because their house is on fire, or there's a crime, or someone's injured or ill, or somebody's dead, and we need help, and we needed you to do it, perfectly, do it right the first time. We need you to do it, so that the law enforcement and the police officers and or fire department are dispatched quick, to the right address. I mean, there's so much in there there's all these logistics, but we have really high expectations. So as part of the victim services training, they took us on the tour of these call centers, and it was really, really interesting because I had my own sort of expectation, but I hadn't ever been in that room, and we were, of course, segregated a little bit so that people, they were working. It was in the evening. It was during a very light period typically for them, but they were there on call. And so it was interesting to just sort of think about all of it and to see all the technology. The technology, obviously, because like I just said, because, they're there taking the call, which could be on a mobile, which usually, now there'll be a mobile call. So they've got to be able to have the technology to sort of see where exactly is the person. The person calling may be injured, maybe, under incredible stress, right? So literally there's a fire, there's a criminal thing happening. So they may not be speaking clearly. They may be overcome by emotion, and they're trying to get information from them, right? So they have all these really, it was fascinating, the technology and the logistics and the screens, and then they're at the same time having to interface with these different, entities that they're dispatching, right? So the fire and police and EMS, EMT, emergency medical, the ambulance, so, and all this has to happen quick. It was really interesting. Okay. So victim services volunteering program was because I was going through the process to be trained to be dispatched on the scene. And that's what it was. It was really intense because obviously the police department, when people complete this program, then your job as a volunteer is when the bad thing happens, then, whenever it's your time and you're signed up, then you go to that scene. There's the car accident. There's the homicide or the suicide or just, a deceased person, found in their place. And you're dealing with all of it. So those people on the scene, the family members or friends and loved ones that show up, the grief, the anger, it was very intense. But it was one of the most interesting things I ever did. I moved from that part of the country to another place to live, so I'd never was able to work the way I'd intended to, but I've actually considered going back and doing some of that victim services work. So that gave me a lot of insight into this question. Colleague experienced tragic death, a loved one, what do you do? Also in my own personal life, and we're not going to spend this whole show on this, I've certainly experienced my own share of, tragic deaths. At this point, the hardest, I don't know if hardest or the most insightful thing, suicide is a horrible, just horrible. And so I have certainly experienced that, my only sibling. And so I've been through this grief, the tragic death of a loved one. And then have been formally trained. So it's not just my own random, opinion or whatever. I thought a really impressive program uh, set up to handle these types of victim services and exactly to answer the show question. What do you do? And someone else, this specifically asking about a work colleague, because of course it's mostly what we focus on. But you could apply this to really anybody. So when you look on the show notes, again, come to page 181, CourtneyAnderson.com. You'll see a couple of things that are the only things I'm going to ask you to remember. One, be there. Two, listen. That's it. In some ways, those of us who have experienced tragic death of loved ones, it's easier. Because when someone else experiences tragic death of a loved one, you have been through this yourself, and it gives you sort of a shortcut to understand, at least in some ways, what the person's experiencing and then what might be effective. So like I said, we're always trying to look big picture. If you have not experienced a tragic death of a loved one, in many ways it's more difficult. A, because you never had this happen, so you don't know. And the other thing, my suspicion, is that since it's never happened to you, but it happens to someone else that you know, for many people that might be the closest to their own, individual lives that's ever happened. This bad thing that happened to someone else that they know. And it may then trigger for them their own fears and anxiety. What if this happens to me someday? How would I handle it? And they might sort of veer off from the issue. And what the issue is the colleague has experienced this tragic death of a loved one. What should I do? That's the issue. But someone who maybe this is a quote, the worst thing that's ever happened to them. And I'm not being facetious. For some people, that it really will be the worst thing that ever happened to them, because they may think, I've never had anything like this. I've never known anyone where anything like this has happened. I've only maybe seen it in a movie or something. And now this is, it's more real than I've ever experienced. And so it might sound strange to say that's the worst thing that's happened to them, when actually you could say, well, nothing's happened to them, right? It was their coworker, or somebody that used to work with them or whatever. So how can, but that may be the closest they've come to something like this, and it may for them trigger a whole bunch of their own issues with, again, their own fear and anxiety and apprehension, all that, which unfortunately takes them away from the question. The question is, what should I do about this other person who suffered this tragic death? And we don't want to then leave that issue and then go talk about your own individual fears, concern, apprehension, anxiety that are triggered by somebody else's situation. You're supposed to be worrying about the other person right now, not yourself. But let's walk through it. So the two things we're going to memorize were easy. Be there and listen. That was it. It's written down on the page for you on the show page, but that's it. I mean, in some ways, actually, this is a really easy answer. Right? Normally we talk about the fact that we don't give, absolutes, and, and often in life there isn't the answer to the question. But in this one, I'm going to say, you'll be most of the way to the answer by just those two things. Be there and listen. For a couple of reasons. Look on the show page and you'll see some quoted information from a New Yorker, which is periodical article about grief. Okay, and so here's something that I think is really to the point of my two issues. All right, so I'm reading from the quote there from the New Yorker on the show page, and the links on the show page, and it says, okay, many mourners experience grief as a kind of isolation, one that is exacerbated by the fact that one's peers, neighbors, and coworkers may not really want to know how you are. We've adopted a sort of ask, don't tell policy. The question, how are you, is an expression of concern, but mourners quickly figure out that it shouldn't be mistaken for actual inquiry. This is why. This is why the only two things we're supposed to memorize are be there and listen. And I really want you to understand as much as you can, if this hasn't happened to you, what tends to happen in societies. Now, depending on where you are in the world, you may have a totally different societal or cultural reaction. You might be part of a religious group or a community or a geographic region where there's going to be more infrastructure. Where when something tragic happens or a death, there's already protocol and there's a whole bunch of expectations that are already set up. How people grieve in many parts of the world. There's even people wear certain types of clothings, and they engage in certain types of behaviors. It's collectively to all support the what's happened in the U.S. and in many parts of the world. You don't have that outside of, again, if you have a smaller group within your society, some sort of neighborhood group or social group or religious or cultural ethnic group or something like that, where they've already set up a whole bunch of protocol. But in the larger society at large, the expectation is exactly what this article is referencing. People don't really want to know. And there's also an expectation that whatever that bad thing was, that you're going to, quote, put it behind you. So if you read the larger New York report, I actually talk a lot about that. This idea that, hey, the bad thing happened, and that people are aware of that. But there's a couple of things that happen. People do not want to talk about this. And like I said, I think, and we studied this in some of the victim services training programs, where they had all kinds of experts come in and talk to us, right? So from the police to social workers and counselors and all kind of people who different aspects of dealing with the issue of, victim services, and somebody who's literally in the moment of something, literally they're right there when their loved one is killed or dies. That's one type of challenge, and then they're right there on the scene, and how do all the different ways that people respond. Okay, here's sort of the again from a. If you're in a part of the world that's more sort of attuned to this, individuality, individualism, right? Often, like I said, you don't have these collective societal things where that's, where everybody knows, hey, this is how long we're going to mourn, this is what we're going to wear, this is what we're going to do. And there's all these sort of formal things that have already been set up to bring attention to the grief, right? And in many ways to help the people who are, most deeply affected, because you already have all this, support and all of these protocols and all of this attention. The challenge, though, again, when you're in these places where you don't have those, or even if you do, they're more limited, is how do you integrate things that have literally changed everything for the person who's grieving? I mean, everything, and everything has changed for them. But the other people, like at work, are like, nothing really has changed. I mean, they heard about this, or maybe they were even sad about it. Maybe they even knew the person's loved one. But, we have, things go on. We have stuff to do, and the person who's in grief often feels at some point a sense of anger that everybody else is going on, like nothing happened. Now, one of the ways I individually found some level of ability to process this was, well, it makes sense. I mean, there's somewhere around 7 billion people on the planet. So if every single time that one of us dies, and so even in a tragic death, so let's just say, well, we're not kind of all deaths, right? Because somebody lives a long life, and then they were 110 years old, and then they finally just the heart gave out. It's sad, but they lived a really long life, and they had a great life, and whatever. Even if you only limit it down to the tragic deaths, right? It was a young child. It was a person in the prime of their life. It was a person who, when they it was an accident, or it was a crime, or it was a suicide, or whatever. Even if you only do those deaths, it's still a huge toll. And if everybody on the planet had to stop every single time that one of these tragic deaths happened, well, then we would never be able to do anything, because they're happening all the time. And you can sort of see it. This is at least this sort of helped me. When you think about it logically, well, then nothing could ever. There would be nothing would ever exist. You couldn't have anything. You couldn't have the 911 dispatchers, the operators that I mentioned earlier. They're taking phone calls because they would have to stop every single time there was a tragic death. You couldn't have any type of school, or you just couldn't have life. You couldn't have society. You couldn't have anything, because it would all have to stop constantly. And when you add in these really tragic things that'll happen, a huge natural disaster or acts of man that lead to these awful tragedies, right? War and things like that, where, oh my goodness, there's somebody who had nothing to do with this war, wasn't even an adult, he was a child or somebody who wasn't even involved. Uh-oh, now they've been killed. Well, if we stopped all the time, we would never, no one could do anything. Nothing would ever function, right? You couldn't do anything. You couldn't go out to eat because, you try to go out to eat. Uh-oh, we have to stop again. We can't all, because we have to all stop and mourn because this tragic thing happened. So I'm way oversimplifying it, but this is sort of the crude outlines that it really did at some point kind of help me process or in some way, because I thought, well, then nothing would ever happen, right? So okay, that kind of makes more sense. When I talk about this, the two things, be there and listen, and I read that quote, and it talked about the ask, don't tell. That's been my personal experience, and the training I had was that's exactly what happens. That because it's awful. We said tragic death. Now some people say, well, all death is tragic. Well, not necessarily. Again, when you talk to somebody, they might be really sad. Oh, my grandpa is 110, and he's a wonderful person, and it hurts them, and they're grieving, but it's extra. There's like an extra dimension to it when the person, it was their you know they were getting married the next day, and we were out having their celebration for the night, the night before, and they were walking across the street, and they were so happy, and there was a picture of them, and then 2 seconds later, a drunk driver killed them, or some criminal came down and killed them, or whatever. I mean, it's just because they hadn't lived and done everything. And then the way it happens. So you have all these extra elements. If it's a criminal act, if it's a suicide, it's a in some ways the person, sort of murdered themselves, and there's all of that's like a really sophisticated multi-level pain and anger, and there's so much to all of this, right? So part of the reason why there's the ask don't tell is that people who haven't been through this, which is going to be the majority of people, obviously, right, don't even want to imagine. And like I said, that's where we're taking away. The issue was my colleagues experienced tragic death. What should I do? We mentioned what you should do: be there and listen. That's it. The word need to memorize. Now we're exploring a little bit here in this short show of why that doesn't happen. And a lot of reason that people can't be there is because they don't want to be there. People feel like, I don't want to sit around and listen to what happened when your child was, killed. Because for a lot of people, what that'll trigger, again, taking it away from the issue, but in a selfish focus, they'll start thinking about their own child, and they'll think, well, I don't want to sit here and listen to them. What was the second step? Listen. They'll think, I don't want to sit here and listen to them talk about your child, was walking down the street and tripped and fell and hit their head and died, or I don't want to hear about their child was at the same, birthday party my kid was at, and then their kid drowned. I don't want to hear about, their kid was in the car and, or the school bus and there was the accident and their child died. I don't want to hear about it because I don't want to think about my child dying. And that's just a very realistic thing that happened. So when we talked about something, and it's on the page, on the show page, 181 there, CourtneyHerson.com, and you think, well, be there and listen. That's nothing. It's everything. Because for multiple reasons, these are the hardest things for people to do. They're not going to be there. Now, here's something you have to remember. When the tragic thing happens, in the immediacy of it, then there's a ton of attention. And it may be the law enforcement and the fire department was there because, the house was burned down, people were there, and there's all this noise and there's all this activity. In a way, it distracts people. And in many cultures, in the U.S. and many parts of the world, then people do come initially. And, they'll bring food, or they'll, and there's activity, and then there's some sort of activity about, we have to plan stuff. We've got to plan. What do we, and this hasn't happened to you, you don't think about all this, but there's so many steps to this. Where is the body? How do we claim it? Who's got to go down there and get it? What are we going to do? Remember, this is a tragic thing, so it's not the person who's, 110 years old and who, is pre-planned what they would love their service to be or whatever. You're talking about the little kid or the young person or the person who's, in the prime of their life. They're 55 years old, and they're having a great day, and boom, right? So nobody had planned it. But when you're in this in real life, there's all these stuff has to be done. There's phone calls, and there's, you got to go to the morgue, or you got to, and if there's an investigation into either the accident or the crime, and you got to deal with the police, and then you have to get a death certificate, and then you got to, if you don't have, stuff's not organized, you got to find whatever you're going to do. Are we going to have a memorial service? Are we going to have a funeral? Are we going to, what are we going to, physically, what are we going to do with the remains? If there are remains, are we going to have a cremation? Are we going to have a burial? Or, it's all of this has to be done. And again, in some ways, it gives people stuff to do and it keeps people busy. But that all takes just a short amount of time. So within a few days, definitely within a few weeks, it becomes incredibly quiet. And when you talk about isolation, I mentioned, the reason you're isolated is because I think some people feel like, well, we did show up and listen. And they did. They came that day, or they came to the memorial service or the burial or whatever. And they did. And they brought food and they asked how they were and or whatever. But that's just, again, that happens in a really short amount of time. The challenge, though, is what happens a week to 10 days to 2 weeks, a month later, which is nothing if you're the person who's suffered this tragic loss of your loved one. It's nothing. One thing that you want to note also, in that resource, when you read the full article, they talked about the sense of time is off because, when something like this happens in your mind, it seems like it's a marker for everything. Like everything like sort of stops in weird ways, and time is totally, your perception of time is really different than other people's, right? But for everybody else, it's like, it's been 2 months or 2 weeks or 2 years. What's wrong with you? Why are you still, what's the problem? And that is awful, horrible feeling, because it's a reminder, of course, that yeah, your world is totally, let's just say, changed. But to other people, not really. And again, we have to just think logically. We can't, again, have the whole planet stop every single time this happens. It makes sense that nothing would function, but it's just a devastating, and your emotionally, it diminishes what this was, like everything, like the entirety of that entire person, right? It's very painful. So when we talk about the fact that in many cultures, people, they don't want to know, and also that there's a little flurry of activity for a very short amount of time at the beginning, and then it's quiet, and often that's where people are incredibly isolated. And within their existing structures that they had prior to this, right, the existing, friendships or family members or whatever, everyone has all these individual reactions, and everything, especially because it's a tragedy, right? So nobody planned. So it wasn't one of these things like, oh, someone had been sick and they were, we knew, and they were ill for a really long time, and so we were talking and planning and sharing and all this kind of stuff. This is this tragedy, it out of the blue. So whatever things that you didn't get to say and whatever things that were left undone, they are permanently there. So it adds all this extra layer, and it also means that people often can't, there's nobody there to sort of to lean on or to help, because everybody's in their own, that close family member group or in friendship or whoever else was in that group, often none of them are able to do anything to help anybody else because they're all devastated and suffering in their own private ways. It's just awful. So when you ask what you should do, be there and listen. Immediately what you should do, be there. Now remember, in the immediacy of it, the person is dealing with just what you would imagine. Every sensory time, everything is sort of distorted for quite a while, or in some ways permanently. So they may not actually remember or be able to process you, saying, "Oh, I'm so sorry," or sending a condolence note or whatever. But that's irrelevant. Do that. You need to be there at the beginning as much as you're able. So depending on how well you know the person or how comfortable you are, or whatever, you need to do something to acknowledge it. Trust me, they will later. It will mean something to them that you did whatever it was. I don't care if it's a short little email or, whatever, condolences, just acknowledge it, okay? And then later, later can be, 3 days, 3 months, 3 years, I don't care, later, depending on the relationship, then when you're seeing them, let's say they're still working there and you're still working there, the more time has gone by, the more important it is that you be there. Now, remember, when you're there, the most important thing you're doing is listen. You're not talking. So please, and I'm begging you, do not start talking about yourself. Do not say things like, oh, I'm so sorry to hear about your, your wife. I had a pet rabbit one time that I lost, and it was just really tough. Don't do anything like this. Don't make any analogy between. Now, if you've been through something really similar, like you have, their close loved one was murdered, and you had a close loved one that was murdered, yes, that actually can be helpful. Your close loved one had committed suicide, their close loved one committed suicide, can be very helpful. Your close loved one, even if it was a pet, it's not the problem necessarily, but that's part of it. And the other part of it is um, your loss of your pet rabbit is not comparable to their human loss of their child, spouse, parent, best friend, life partner, whatever. Like, just be quiet. So most of the time, the easy way to fix this is just shut up. And that's why it says be there and listen. Don't talk. Don't also talk about anything about yourself. Don't say anything like the things I alluded to earlier. Oh, I was so upset to hear about what happened to your child. It just made me think about my beautiful child. I'm so grateful she's alive and okay. Stuff like that is so cruel. Hey, here's the thing. They know your child's still alive, right? Just like you know their child is dead. So you don't have to say anything. This doesn't need to be pointed out. And yeah, because things like this happen, right? And I'm begging you, shut up. A lot of times when you talk to people about things like this, they'll say, well, I don't know what to say. Okay, I'm not saying that there is anything that you could say that's going to change or fix or make it better. You can't. This is. And it's awful. What you can do, and this will help, is be there. Just sitting in silence with someone, you know what, makes a difference. Acknowledging that that person exists, that everybody's trying to pretend like they don't want to talk to, because every time they look at that person, it reminds them of the murder or the tragic accident or the suicide. And especially, for these things that, oh, it was on the news or whatever, it just reminds them. And they don't want to be around that person because then it reminds them of that sad, bad thing, and they don't want to think about the sad, bad thing. So that further isolates the person. Just sitting there with them, oh, it's time for break. Let me go sit with them in the break room. And then you could say something like, how are you? And then this is the difference. Shut up and actually listen. I want to read this from that same New Yorker piece. Again, it's on the show notes and the link to the full article, which I found to be really insightful and interesting, thought-provoking, no matter your perspective. Okay, so here it goes. I'm reading a quote. Scientists have found that grief, like fear, is a stress reaction, attended by deep physiological changes. Levels of stress hormones like cortisol increase. Sleep patterns are disrupted. The immune system is weakened. Mourners may experience loss of appetite, palpitations, even hallucinations. They sometimes imagine that the deceased has appeared to them in the form of a bird, say, or a cat. It is not unusual for a mourner to talk out loud, to cry out to a lost one, in an elevator or while walking the dog. Okay, this is really, really important. Now, for those of you, again, who already experienced these things, you're thinking, well, yeah. And this also should make you feel better, quote unquote. Not better like it was before, but better in terms of you're not unusual or weird. Yes, the hallucinations, the talking out loud, and just in waves where someone's overcome, or it looks like on the outside, like they've, like, when they're talking and they're crying out loud and crying out to the elevator or whatever, it seems like but it's not unusual. So that's why I wanted to read that. I think it's helpful for all of us. The thing is, when you're the one that's having to be there while they're crying out to their loved one or telling you about the hallucination, it's even more uncomfortable. Yeah, it is. Do you know what a gift it is for you to go to someone who's isolated, who other people are intentionally doing everything they can to diminish their loved one and the bad things that have happened, and you just sit with them and just let them talk? I talked to a woman one time. This is right after I was dealing with my most tragic loss, and she was saying something, and I think I was doing some of this where I was in the throes of one of these things where you're not quite focused. And she said something that she had lost a child, I think a little girl. And she said that for years she would run around where they lived, calling out to her and crying to her because she knew she was there. And even though that sounds, if to an outsider, obviously I'm not talking about any kind of spiritual religious. I'm just talking about sort of, in our physical realm as we know it. So we'll just call it, in the physical realm as we understand it. Your daughter wasn't there because she buried her. But I must tell you, it was a wonderful time because it really helped me feel A, less isolated, and B, I get it. I totally understood. Just sitting there. So in a way, she was there for me. She was being there and listening, but I was also being there for her and listening for her. It was powerfully helpful. It is extremely hard to do this if you're somebody who's caught up in your own stuff. And your own stuff is your own fear, your own anxiety, your own apprehension, your own, what about my child? What about my spouse? What about my parent? What about my best friend? What about blah, blah, blah? Hey, I got it. But you asked me in the show, the question was, a work colleague's experienced tragic death of a loved one. It said, what should I do? And I'm giving you what you should do. I'm not saying this is what people would want to do. And I'm definitely not saying that this is something that's easy to do. But I'm saying this is the most effective and hopeful thing that you could do. And sometimes people are going to say nothing. And sometimes, I have to mention this. Sometimes I have a few people at my times in my life that did show up, that were there and listened. And I sort of, in my mind, they're sort of like gold star people. Because when I really needed. And they did show up. And I can't even, remember if, whatever. But if they said or didn't, that's irrelevant. I do remember that they did show up. And the thing is, like I said, they're sort of like a gold star person in my world. And there's almost nothing that they could do where I wouldn't be there for them. Because when I really, really, really needed somebody, they showed up. And again, the most important thing is to just show up. And then shut up. And then just listen. And if they start saying things that sound like, they're hallucinations or whatever, that they're, loved one talking to them and they're now a fly on the wall or whatever, like, just listen. Just shut up and listen. Now, of course, you want to be vigilant. So if the person's in this, they talked about, in the quote, right? Lost, because you lose sense of everything. So simple stuff like remembering to drink, to stay hydrated so you don't get so dehydrated, you become, medically in distress, or remembering to eat. It sounds silly if you haven't been through it, but it happens. And again, this is I've been through the training on this and more than just victim services, but certainly that was one of the most intense things I've ever done. I'm just reading from those source quotes. This is not individual. This is something that you need to look out for. So that one of the things you can do, and if you feel like you do need to talk and say something, is these basic things. Remind them to eat and remind them to drink. And if you're somewhere where you can physically bring them something to drink or to eat and sit there and make them eat and drink, and not make them, but hey, remind them. Because they don't, often they'll forget, and they may end up in medical distress where they're having to be treated or hospitalized for this. So these are some simple things you can talk about. Hey, hey, I got something here. Let me get you a drink. Oh, okay. And they sit there, and just sort of nicely watch them. So hydration and that. Yeah, they're going to want to talk about this, or might not want to talk about it at all. They might be totally silent, or they might be saying things that sound like hallucinations, or they may be screaming out in pain and agony. I don't care what they're doing, but you're just going to be there. Now, the beauty of all of this is it's free. And the challenge of all of this is it's going to require you to really reach deep inside. And to put your own individual, fear and apprehension and needs and narcissism aside. And you're only thinking about the other person. I want to mention as we close this episode that there are no rules. A lot of people talk about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and the sort of the stages of dying. And there's the source I have on the show page to a Time magazine article, and it's sort of giving you a little bit more potential information about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross herself. Sort of the book from 1969 where she came up with these alleged stages, right? Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And it talks to you a little bit about the fact that, first of all, she was writing about facing your own death. So she wasn't even writing about somebody who's grieving somebody else's death. And then it goes on and it talks about whether or not some of the things that are out there are myths or not. My sort of general position is that this is an individual thing. So some people, for whatever combination of reasons, personality, experience, environment, whatever, are going to talk. Some people are going to be quiet. Some people are going to be totally silent. They don't speak, right? We know we've read some wonderful works by people who something tragic, bad thing happened, um, and then they were just silent after that. So, it happens with children and happens with adults. Um, some people, literally scream out in agony. It makes people uncomfortable. Well, hey, that's life. This expectation is the one thing I want to close the show with, and you have got to have none. This is not about you. There's no right way or wrong way. Um, it's up to the person. And if you're there and you listen, you can potentially have such a positive impact. And one way to think about it is this: the more the person talks about their loved one, even though it might make you uncomfortable at some level, in a way for them, it might be that they're keeping them alive, and it makes them feel better. You see, they don't want that person to be erased like they never existed. And so, even though you might think, golly, I don't want to hear about their murdered, sister again, they're always going to be like this. They love their loved one. Their love doesn't stop because the person stopped existing. But now they're not able to express it in any way. Because a lot of people don't want to hear about the murder or the suicide or the drowning or the car accident or the bad thing. And in many ways, it also taints and redefines in their mind that entire person's entire life is going to be just how that final couple of moments defines them, right? This is a whole nother thing. I do strongly encourage this. When you're doing your be there and listen, again, I do strongly monitor the basic stuff. Now, the breathing, usually people keep breathing just because usually they do on their own, but hydration and food are really problems. Again, some sort of expression, whether it's, in writing or saying to somebody, hey, I'm so sorry, or whatever it is initially. And the most important part is after that initial flurry that you're there. Reach out. Hey, you want to, I'll just give you a call. You might talk with them on the phone and they might be silent. I don't care. Sit there with them, listen and breathe. You might talk to them on the phone and they're just sort of maybe incoherently, in pain and making these noises you don't even understand. I don't care. Listen. You may sit with them and they start talking about things that are about work and you're thinking, oh, okay, great. And then later they start talking about things that don't make any sense at all. Okay. I don't want you to have any expectations about their stages or how long it's been. I don't want you to say or do anything other than listen. What do you do if they're crying or screaming or yelling? You just listen. And you know how to do this. You use your low and slow, right? So low volume, a low pitch, right? Low your register. Slow, just listen. You might just have to say things like, and then you can say things like, I'm here. I'm here. That's all you have to do. And if they're, why did this happen? Whatever. Just, I'm here. You don't have any answers. I am going to ask you to do this. Now, you and everyone else, we all have our own individual beliefs and values and ideas and all this. Please, I'm begging you, please, please, and I really do. Please keep that inside right now. And by right now, I mean maybe permanently. So if you want to say inside your mind, oh, everything happens for a reason, or this is part of some kind of religious or spiritual plan, or they're in a better, religious or spiritual or, whatever place, I understand that in your mind that may be something that helps you, and it might be something that helps them. So if they say that, whatever they say, again, no, I don't care what they say. They're just words. Then you remember what you're doing. I'm here. I'm here, low and slow like that. This is not a discussion. Remember, we read that it might look like everything, especially people who might look like, hey, they look like they looked before, right? They look fine. It doesn't mean that this has not impacted them, and I do mean in a severe way. Just because they might express it differently doesn't mean that everything's quote like it was before. It isn't. So I know in your mind it might help you to think about your own beliefs and everything and think, oh, thank goodness this happened, or they were done this for a reason, or my religious whatever. even if that person is in your same religious thing and you're sitting in your religious place together, I really am telling you this because when they're ready to get to a place where they're going to be able to do that, then you're going to be listening, and they're going to lead. But in the interim, I don't want you to bring any of this up. I don't want you to say anything about any of this because it may comfort you. So just think it in your mind, like, oh yes, that's what I believe. It's wonderful. It makes me feel better. Great. Right now, this has happened, and they're on their own time schedule, and there's so much that's going on. Leave it alone. It's not helping. It helps you, which is wonderful. So keep that in your mind. Keep thinking that the whole time they're saying whatever you think in your mind. Oh, this is what I believe. That's right. That's for this reason, or this was the plan, or whatever. Then that's awesome. Please don't say that to them. I am begging you. Please, this is not the time. Remember what you're supposed to do. Be there, like breathe. So on the phone, you're listening. I'm breathing. Make those noises. If you're a human in the same space together, if it's appropriate based on who they are and who you are, reach out. Pat them on the back, or touch their hand or whatever, physical. Just sit there, look at them. Just again, be breathing with them in the same space, and then just listen. I understand that a lot of these things that are helping you, and that may eventually they may get to a point where they are, oh, okay, yes, I have the same philosophy, or I have the same belief system, or I have the same whatever. And later they may engage with you in a dialogue and say, oh, I really would like to talk to you about this and that, and you say, oh, okay, now they're ready. And all this other time, and it may be years, I want you to not say that stuff, because it doesn't necessarily, trust me, it may be hard to understand, but it often really is not helping. Just let them sit and express and be. And then we're going to talk about hydration and food very nominally. Hey, have anything to drink? Hey, let me get you something. And bring it over and watch me eat. And then just all the rest of it. Let them say whatever. If they say something to you that's offensive to you, and you're thinking, well, that's not, we're in the same religious group, or the same group where we're not religious, and now they're saying stuff that you're thinking, why are they saying that? That's silly. That's not what we believe. You have to remember, they're dealing with all these other things. We read about the cortisol and the stress and everything. Let them say it. We talked about hallucinations and everything. So who knows, necessarily, this is not about you. It's not even really about them to a certain extent. It's honestly about the loved one. That's who it's really about. I'm begging you, please don't do that stuff. Please. If you have an opinion about all that, and it's important to you, I get it, but you just please don't express to the person. You are really not helping. And I know you don't want to hurt them because you asked the question, what should I do? If you didn't care, you wouldn't be asking the question, what should I do? You do care. You're part of the show. You're part of our community. You do care, and you want to, quote, do the right thing. I'm telling you what the right thing is. Be there, whether it's just listening or breathing or sitting, and then listen. And I don't care what they do. Again, hallucination, yelling out, in agony, or total silence, stoic. You don't even understand. You don't even know if they know you're there, right? No eye contact. They do, at some level, they are aware. And trust me, the isolation, remember we talked about that, where people ask, but they don't really want you to tell them. Let them talk. And if you feel like you can't handle hearing that story about, when their uncle committed suicide one more time, then you're going to have to ask yourself, what kind of person are you? Because I'm going to tell you right now, if you ever are the one, and it's you that's experienced a tragic death, you'll get it. There's no amount of compassion that it will be unappreciated. But I know that you, being part of our program, being part of our community, have it in you because you ask the question, so you care. And I'm telling you what to do. It's simple and it's free. Be there and listen. It is incredibly hard because you have to dissociate yourself and all your own stuff, and thinking about your own mom and your own sister and your own kid and all this kind of stuff, and thinking, oh, I sure wish, I'm glad it's not me, and oh, I hope it doesn't happen to my kid, and whatever. Like, I get it. This isn't about you. Take all that stuff and put it to the side. And then, yeah, it's very uncomfortable, even vicariously. And think about this. If it's uncomfortable, sit there and just vicariously observe the person either in silence or in agony or screaming out or in pain with hallucinations or whatever. If it's just for you, if it's tough, imagine how tough it is for them to experience it. You're just getting a taste of it. So the compassion is there. It's in you. I do really encourage you, again, come to the show page. It was very easy. We only had 2 things that we recommend. Be there and listen. I do ask you to look at those 2 articles and don't get caught up in the thing that you know the answer. There's some really interesting information that there are no expectations, and people are going to grieve how they're going to grieve. So I also would ask you to read in the New Yorker link. There's a good art. It closes with a poem, a part of an Emily Dickinson poem. For her poem, "I measure every grief I meet," and I find that just beautiful. So go, read that, and then think about sure, you think part of you is thinking, wow, I'm glad it's not me, right? My loved one wasn't murdered or killed in an accident or died in a tragic way or committed suicide. I get it. Sure, okay, of course you are. But here's the deal: you don't know. You don't know what the future holds. And you and I understand that these experiences, an opportunity to be sort of in life and learn from life. It's not going to do anything but certainly broaden your understanding of what the human experience is. So we know what to do with our work colleague, and we talked about what we're not going to do. Again, not about you, not about how fortunate you are, not about you're glad it's not your child, not about your any type of religious or spiritual or non-specific religious. So if you're that's my friend and we are longtime atheists together, I get it. Right now, shut up. Just shut all of that up. Shut up. All of your stuff about what happened and why it happened or might not have happened and where the whatever better place and all this, just shut up. This is not the time. It may never be the time. You're going to be there and you're going to listen again and again. There's no limit to the appreciation of your compassion, and I guarantee you that by being there and listening, especially when understanding that people can become isolated and they feel so alone, that you taking that time on that coffee break to sit with them. How are you? And then sit there and listen to it. So then when I'm fine. No, sit there the whole time. Because then they keep talking or paying attention. They're not. And it's okay for them, and you have to let them know, hey, it's okay. I'm here. I'm going to listen. Whatever you need to, I'm here. No, and by you shutting up and keeping all those things in your mind that we talked about in private, that makes them feel safe that they can trust you to share all that stuff that they're really dealing with. And then again, low pitch, slow speed. Oh, and then you have to say something. I'm here. I'm here. And then again, hydration and food. You got to keep those. It sounds really stupid, but it isn't, because often that's not something people are able to focus on, and then you get more problems because now people are having medical distress and hospitalized and stuff. So trust me, all of that. And you may be surprised at what you learn about yourself and what you learn about your capacity to feel. And I guarantee you that you are going to be somebody's. I said they're my personal gold star people, the ones who showed up when I really needed it. You're going to be somebody's gold star person. And I'll tell you what, through all of this, you will gain the ability to then, some other time in your life, you'll be able to help someone else, or you'll be able to help yourself. And there's nothing there but something positive. But this is going to require you stepping up and volunteering for some authentic human interaction. And it is going to be something that, remember, everybody else is avoiding. They're running away from it for good reason, right? Because it's sad and tragic and scary, but not you. You're going to sit with that person. I don't care if they're continents away. You're going to sit on the phone. You're going to sit on the chat. I don't care. Just keep every once in a while checking in. Hey, still there? Skype. You're going to do whatever it takes. Hey, I'm checking in. Still there? And I don't care if it's been 10 years, 30 years. Hey, I'm here. Be there and listen. Be there and listen. Be there and listen. Be there and listen. All right. Thank you for being part of this show today. It was one, I think, where we definitely got into some very important issues. And again, for those of you who did join into the program because you have had this colleague experience tragic death of a loved one, again, my condolences. My condolences. But let's do what we need to. Let's get ready and let's be there and let's listen. Thank you so much.